The story takes place more than a decade after the Civil War. Although the fighting has ended, many Confederate officers responsible for atrocities have escaped punishment and built new lives in the expanding American West. Matthias Breacher is a former Union Army soldier who now works as a Pinkerton detective in the years following the American Civil War. One of the first African American U.S. senators, Senator Benjamin Burke, secretly hires Matthias Breacher to locate these former Confederate war criminals and bring justice where the legal system has failed. Breacher tracks down his first target, former Confederate General Corbin Dandridge. Corbin Dandridge is a former Confederate general who, after the Civil War, has retreated into isolation. Riding up to the Mississippi barn where Dandridge was holed up, he pushed the door open gently and stepped inside without a word. Dandridge is not immediately hostile. Instead, he watched the intruder with a cold, controlled arrogance born of a man who truly believed his bloody past was buried and forgotten. Breacher, however, remains extremely calm. He does not provoke. He simply confirms identity. With that, he reached into his coat, pulled out a Pinkerton detective badge, and tossed it onto the table. The man picked it up, studied it in silence, then exhaled deeply. "It was only a matter of time," he said quietly. "I always knew this day would come." Then, Breacher produced the government warrants. Official execution orders stating that the named Confederate war criminals had already been convicted and sentenced to hang. "I'd prefer you come peacefully," Breacher said, his voice steady. "Face the rope as the law demands." Dandridge's face contorted with rage. Dandridge snatched the warrants straight out of Breacher's hands. "I may no longer wear the uniform of a general," he sneered, "but I still have a few loyal men out there willing to die protecting me." In a flash, his hand dropped to the pistol at his hip. Breacher remained silent, watching him intently. In the span of a single heartbeat, Breacher moved. Breacher walked to the table, retrieved his badge, holstered his smoking gun efficiently, turned his back on the fallen man, and walked out into the sunlight. This was Breacher's 18th assignment. Just 2 more jobs, and his contract with the government would be fulfilled. He would collect a sizable sum of money, retire with clean hands, and finally taste the peaceful life he had deferred for so long. After days of meticulous tracking and quiet inquiries, Breacher finally located his next mark, former Confederate officer Reginald Cook. As he approached the modest homestead, he saw a young woman stood in front of a farmhouse, a rifle raised, aimed at some horsemen. Breacher paused, listening. But before he could understand the situation, the men soon mounted up and rode off. Then the girl turned the rifle toward him. Breacher raised his hands slowly, offering a calm, patient explanation. "I have no part with those men who just left." The girl's name was Sarah Cook, and she was Reginald Cook's daughter, though her father was the very target he had come for. Breacher spun a necessary lie to disarm her. "I'm an old friend of your father's." Hearing this, the tension left the girl's shoulders, and she slowly lowered the rifle.
"You came to say goodbye?"
Goodbye.
You don't know.
Know what, man?
Expecting another ruthless criminal, Breacher instead discovers an elderly man dying of pneumonia, lovingly cared for by his daughter, Sarah. Looking down at the dying old man, the innate decency that Breacher had spent years suppressing flared to the surface. He found himself utterly unable to state his grim purpose to a family already broken by grief. Yet, duty demanded a confrontation. Hesitating for a long moment, Breacher finally drew the badge from his pocket and showed it to Reginald. Reginald, upon seeing the badge, showed no fear, only relief. He had served under the very general Breacher had executed days prior, carrying out countless atrocities in the shadows of the war. He had lived with guilt for years, haunted by the shadows of his wartime deeds. Now, plagued by terminal illness and fearing he was nothing but a burden to his daughter. Death did not look like a punishment, it looked like absolution. His only plea, not to be hanged beneath the jujube tree outside, where his wife lay buried. He did not want her to witness his body hanging above her grave. Breacher stood in heavy silence, his kinder nature warring with duty. He could not bring himself to string up a dying man who had spent his remaining years in genuine, agonizing repentance. Then, quietly, he made his decision.
I will not hang you. I will not shoot you. I will let you pass as God sees fit. But I will stay here, for it is my job to watch men like you take their last breath. That is the burden I must carry in this life.
And so he stayed at the ranch. The daughter, Sarah, unaware of his true purpose, welcomed him warmly as her father's old comrade. She prepared a comfortable bed for him, cooked a hearty meal, and even dressed up for supper. Her laughter filling the small space as they shared stories by lamplight. Breacher, who had come to claim a life, felt a deepening shame. He wanted to confess everything, but the words died on his lips. For the first time in years, the drifting lawman found himself unwilling to shatter the fragile warmth around him. The days flowed by, silent and serene. Sarah's affection grew for the thoughtful, witty man who had entered their lives. During this period, he helps repair the ranch, protects Sarah from hostile neighbors, and experiences something he has long been denied: a sense of peace in family. From his sickbed, Reginald watched it all, a quiet contentment settling over his final days. One afternoon, Breacher spotted figures on a distant ridge, watching the homestead. Pressed by Breacher, the truth came out. Fred Quaid, a powerful local rancher, had been trying to buy their land for pennies on the dollar. With Reginald ill and bedridden, the pressure had escalated into open intimidation. The riders Breacher had spotted earlier were Fred and his enforcers. "If the day comes when I go to meet the Almighty," Reginald pleaded, "I beg you to look after my daughter. Don't leave her to face this cruel world alone and helpless." Breacher did not answer. He stood up and left the house. The next morning, he checked his guns, told Sarah he was going to town for supplies, and rode hard for Fred's ranch. He intended to iron things out through peaceful negotiation. But the moment Breacher rode into the compound, before he could even speak, Fred's men raised their rifles, their eyes mocking. Fred strolled out of the house, confident, dismissive.
"You can get yourself shot riding onto a man's ranch, stranger."
Breacher, still on horseback, asked him to stop targeting Sarah's land. He even offered the modest savings he had accumulated, everything he had to his name, and offered it as a peace offering. Fred looked at the money and let out a disdainful laugh.
"I don't need money, but I need that land."
He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a harsh threat. "Stay out of it, or you'll regret it." Breacher's expression didn't change. He kept his eyes locked on the tyrant. Fred, realizing this was no ordinary drifter who could be easily spooked by a few harsh words, proposed a challenge: to settle the dispute by means of a brutal fistfight. If Breacher won, the land dispute would end, Sarah's land would be spared. Breacher glanced at the two men standing nearest. One was slight and wiry, the other an older man with graying hair. Assessing the odds, Breacher nodded, agreeing to the duel. But the trap had already been sprung. The door creaked open, and a towering, muscular brute of a man strode out. For a fleeting second, a pang of regret hit Breacher. But he thought of Sarah waiting for him in the cabin, summoned his courage, and began the duel. The fight was brutal and lopsided. Breacher was quickly overwhelmed by the brute's sheer size and strength. Heavy blows rained down, leaving Breacher battered, bloodied, and broken against the dirt. Pride swelled in his opponent until Breacher seized an opening. Drawing on his remaining strength, Breacher lunged forward, throwing his weight into a desperate, ferocious assault. In the end, he relied on his quick wits and sheer grit to win the lopsided duel. Fred, seething, honored the bet grudgingly and ordered Breacher off his property.
"Get off my land."
Covered in wounds, Breacher ignored the searing pain and galloped toward the Cook Ranch. The moment he arrived, he found Sarah and broke the news.
"That man Quaid won't be bothering you anymore."
Looking at the scars on his neck and hands, Sarah's eyes filled with heartache. Breacher's complete disregard for his own safety to settle the dispute for her completely won her heart. Not only did Sarah prepare a warm bath for him, but she also walked right in while he was bathing, without any hesitation, to apply medicine to his wounds. The distance between them collapsed quietly, without announcement, as if it had always been inevitable. It was at that very moment that the dishonest Fred, accompanied by several of his men, quietly approached the Cook Ranch. Inside, Breacher was completely unaware of the danger outside. He was preparing to share an intimate moment with the girl he loved, his attention entirely consumed by her presence, his guard lowered to nothing. Only the old horse, his loyal companion of many years, sensed it first. It reared back and let out a sharp, urgent neigh. In an instant, Breacher realized something was wrong. Years of honed frontier instincts overrode the romance in his chest. In a heartbeat, he transformed from the unsuspecting quarry into a calculating hunter waiting for his opening. And when the moment came, he struck first. Quickly, he freed the horse, slapping its flank to send it bolting. As the men's attention snapped toward the fleeing animal, Breacher burst into the open, his revolver spitting lead. Fred's crew was so busy dodging his bullets that they completely lost sight of the cabin. Hidden inside the cabin until that moment, Sarah rushed out and fired without hesitation. In moments, 3 of Fred's men lay dead. Only the crafty Fred managed to survive the initial onslaught, scrambling for cover behind the fence. Gunfire traded back and forth, but neither could land a decisive hit. The battle settled into a tense stalemate, each waiting for the other's mistake. Then, Sarah's deathly ill father dragged himself from his sickbed. With shaking determination, he joined the fight. Realizing the tide had turned irrevocably against him, the cornered Fred broke cover for a final, cowardly gambit. Reginald is fatally shot while helping defend his home, and Breacher ultimately kills Fred. Breacher watched in anguished fury, completely consumed by a wave of grief and self-blame. In his mind, Fred had originally only intended to seize the girl's few acres of land through cheap, dishonest means. It was Breacher's intervention, his attempt to play the hero, that had provoked everything. And now, because of him, Sarah's father lay dead. Afterwards, he personally builds Reginald's coffin and assists Sarah in burying her father. And when Sarah knelt by the grave, crying uncontrollably, Breacher rose quietly and left. Heart heavy with remorse, he approached his horse, drew out the final warrant from his pocket, and glanced back towards Sarah. One word from her, just one, and he would toss the warrant into the wind, abandon his contract, and spend the rest of his days safeguarding her life. But she only looked at him in silence. Breacher mounted and rode away hard, no longer the cold government executioner but a man burdened by deep longing and regret. That pull would make his final hunt far harder than any before. After days of tracking and digging, he finally caught wind of his final target, Huxley Wainwright. The former Confederate captain was holed up in Knife's Edge, a corrupt mining town near the border. But when he arrived, he discovered that Wainwright was now the town's sheriff. Unlike his previous targets, Wainwright possesses political power, loyal deputies, and complete control over the community. The only fortunate detail was that Wainwright did not recognize Breacher, nor did he know that Breacher had come to kill him. Yet, Wainwright was a predator by nature, hyper-vigilant to any shift in his domain. The moment Breacher sat down at the local saloon, he glided over and seated himself across from the newcomer. He tried to extract information through casual conversation. But Breacher spoke little. He remained guarded, silent, unreadable. Wainwright gained nothing. Yet his suspicion only deepened. He called over one of the saloon's working girls, his voice suddenly dropping into a harsh, menacing growl as he accused her of skimming from her earnings. Terrified, the woman immediately handed over the $12 she had secretly kept. Wainwright smiled coldly. He slammed his thick palm down over the money, trapping it against the wood. Good. As long as you behave. Then he stood up, turned his back to her, and counted the money carefully, $12, every cent accounted for. Only then did he suddenly turn around and shoot her dead in front of everyone. Then he spoke loudly. The entire town belongs to me. Anyone who betrays me will end up like this. Breacher watched in silent fury. Beneath his calm exterior burned disgust and rage. He silently vowed that this man, who treated human life like nothing, would be brought to justice. After finishing his threat, Wainwright walked back toward Breacher.
We shall have coffee in the morning. That is, if you're still here, sir.
He then drank a shot of strong liquor in one gulp, smirked, and walked away. Knowing just how sadistic Wainwright could be, Breacher remained on high alert. Darkness brought no rest, sleep was impossible under the shadow of such raw danger. Late into the night, he heard a soft knock at the door. Slowly, he reached for his gun, chambered around, and opened the door. Standing in the hallway wasn't a hired assassin, but rather Alice Hollenbeck, the tavern owner. She held a bottle of liquor in one hand and a glass in the other, her expression sincere, as if she simply wanted to talk. Breacher lowered his guard and put away his weapon. As she poured the drinks, Alice unburdened her soul. Her husband had left her the tavern when he died. But later, Wainwright seized it by force, stripping her ownership and reducing her to nothing more than a salaried manager. She told him that many people in the town hated Wainwright, but no one dared speak. After a long pause, Breacher stood up and showed her his Pinkerton badge, followed by the federal execution order for Wainwright's death. "I will end him," he said firmly. "I'll give this town back its peace." For a moment, Alice seemed to see a faint light in the darkness. Then she left quietly. Unbeknownst to Breacher, the tavern owner was acting on Wainwright's orders. And the drink she'd offered him was spiked with a potent sedative. Not long after she left, Wainwright's men stormed into the room. Breacher, already weakened by the drug, could not resist. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself bound to a chair, staring into the smug face of Wainwright. His cover was blown, his weapons and credentials lay on the table. He knew he would not leave alive. Yet even in the face of death, he shouted without fear.
Captain, you are a convicted war criminal.
Furious upon hearing this, Wainwright ordered his men to brutally waterboard Breacher, who was tied to a chair. He coughed violently, struggling for breath, the suffocating sensation of death pressing down on him. But he forced the words out again.
And you've been sentenced to hang.
Another round of brutal waterboarding followed, aiming to break his will. Even after enduring torture, Breacher refuses to surrender.
To see those wishes carried out.
Wainwright finally stopped listening. He ordered his men to take Breacher outside the town and bury him alive. A final blow to the temple sent Breacher into total darkness. When he woke again, he saw two men digging a grave in the wilderness. They were preparing to bury him alive. Accepting that his time was up, Breacher watched as one of the men tossed his shovel aside and began rifling through Breacher's pockets, looking to plunder whatever coin he had left. The thug pulled out a fistful of crumpled bills, laughing at his stroke of luck. In that instant, Breacher struck, swift, decisive. And once again, through sharp instinct and will, he escaped death. Escaping the pit, Breacher did not flee the territory. Instead, he took refuge in an abandoned church outside the town, resting and gathering strength over several days. Then, one morning, he cleaned himself, composed himself, and placed his Pinkerton detective badge on the church window ledge. Without hesitation, he pushed open the wooden doors and returned to Knife's Edge that had been ruled by fear for so long. A brutal battle began. He moved quickly toward the tavern, the place where Wainwright's men gathered most often. Breacher chambered a round and fired. One after another, Wainwright's men fell. 7 of them were killed inside the tavern. Wainwright, drawn by the shots, arrived alone. The two men faced each other. No words passed. Wainwright suddenly tossed aside his gun and proposed a formal duel. Breacher's hand drifted to his holster. The sheriff mirrored him. They stood frozen, eyes locked, the only sound their breathing. At a distance, a crowd of townsfolk gathered, holding their collective breath. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Minutes passed. Then shots rang out. Breacher's bullet found its mark, felling the corrupt sheriff and fulfilling his vow to liberate the town. Simultaneously, Wainwright's return fire struck true, a mortal wound. Leaning against a tree, Breacher turned his gaze toward the distant homestead where Sarah waited. As life ebbed, a vision took him, riding back to her, the place he had longed for since leaving. He saw Sarah running to meet him, felt her loving embrace. In that warmth, he closed his eyes for the last time.